Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, one of the most mind-boggling transformations in history has got to be the early Christian church.
Yeah.
I mean, from a tiny little group in Jerusalem to basically like this dominant force
Yeah.
across the entire Roman Empire.
It's true.
And even beyond.
Right.
Like all within, what, 500 years?
500 years.
It's just wild.
Right.
Like, think about it. By 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, they had 318 bishops there.
Wow.
Churches from Spain all the way to Persia.
That's impressive.
It just makes you wonder, like, how did this small movement become so big?
So quickly.
So powerful, so fast?
That's the million-dollar question, right? What were those methods?
Right.
And the factors that really drove this growth, because it's not just, a geographical spread, although that is impressive in itself.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the focus of our deep dive today, right?
Yeah.
And to unpack it a little better, we're going to look at two kind of phases, two eras. The ante-Nicene period, roughly from 100 to 325 AD.
Gotcha.
And then the post-Nicene era from 325 to 500.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Close of the Apostolic Age. So we're talking 95 to 100 AD.
Yeah.
What does the church even look like then?
Yeah.
Because I'm guessing it's a far cry from hundreds of bishops showing up at Nicaea.
Oh, for sure. At that point, the church was still extremely small. You're probably looking at no more than 100 congregations scattered across the Roman world. And what's interesting is that these were mainly urban centers.
Okay.
And that really reflects the missionary strategy, especially somebody like Paul, who really focused on the major cities as hubs to reach wider areas.
Right.
Now, the common language was predominantly Greek,
Okay.
which is the lingua franca, basically the common language, across most of the Eastern Roman Empire.
And so I know in the beginning there's a very strong Jewish influence, obviously,
Right.
on the early church.
Sure, because the very first followers of Jesus were Jewish. And that existing network of synagogues provided a really natural point of contact and even a familiar structure
Right. That's true.
for these early believers. However, as that Christian message spread more and more to non-Jews, to Gentiles, and especially after that destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD,
Right.
you see a shift in the character of the church becoming more Hellenistic. So basically adopting the Greek language
Right.
and thought patterns and cultural practices.
So where do we see the early churches at this point?
So some of the early clusters of Christian communities, you see them popping up in regions like Palestine, Asia Minor, especially those western parts that Paul really focused on,
Right.
Macedonia, Achaia, which is in Greece, and even some of those Mediterranean islands like Cyprus and Crete.
Right.
And then, of course, you have Rome itself, which is this important early center.
Yeah, and we hear about these early traditions, right, of these people taking the message further out, like Thaddeus going to Edessa. Mark in Alexandria, were these really significant at this point?
They are really fascinating glimpses into that early spread.
Yeah.
And I think they probably hold some historical truth.
Yeah.
However, the overall number of churches that were really firmly established beyond those core areas was still limited at this point.
Yeah.
Even those less certain traditions like Paul going to Spain or Thomas going all the way to India.
Right.
The major centers of Christian life were still places like Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, and Rome.
Yeah.
And those probably had the largest and most well-organized congregations at that point. Most of the others were probably much smaller, more localized gatherings.
So it's kind of remarkable then, right?
Yeah.
To think how they go from this tiny footprint
It is.
to such huge growth. So what made that happen?
Well, there were several, I guess you could say, enabling factors
Yeah.
that really created this fertile ground for the church to flourish.
Yeah.
Ironically, one of the biggest factors was the Roman Empire itself.
Okay.
The Romans were known for building roads, right?
True.
And this extensive network of well-maintained roads really facilitated travel and communication over vast distances.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And this efficient infrastructure, it not only allowed for faster movement of people, like missionaries,
Yeah.
but it also allowed for the easier dissemination of letters and ideas,
Right.
which created a sense of interconnectedness among these Christian communities, which was really important.
It's true. Yeah, like having good solid roads and communication would just open up a ton of possibilities.
Yeah, and then closely linked to that was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
Right.
So for a considerable period, there was relative peace and stability
Yeah.
across the entire Mediterranean world.
Yeah.
The Roman legions, they maintained order on the land.
Mm.
The Roman navy largely suppressed piracy on the seas.
Right.
So both land and sea travel were safer than they'd be for centuries to come.
Right. So it was a perfect environment for traveling and sharing a new message.
And then you have the widespread use of Greek,
Mm-hmm.
which we talked about before.
Yeah.
And that acted as another huge unifying force.
Yeah, because you could go anywhere.
Right.
You didn't have to learn new languages.
You didn't have to learn a bunch of local dialects.
Right.
You could communicate with a huge segment of the population almost anywhere.
It really streamlined things, yeah.
It did. So those were huge factors. But were there other, like, intellectual or cultural things
Yeah, good question.
going on that made people more open to Christianity?
It seems like it would have to be, right?
Yeah.
Something more than just the practicalities.
Absolutely. And the influence of Greek philosophy played a significant role here
Okay.
because it really fostered, among the educated elite at least, a love for intellectual inquiry and a real pursuit of truth.
Yeah.
But at the same time, kind of surprisingly, it also led to a dissatisfaction with the traditional Roman and Greek pantheon of gods because they were seen as arbitrary and even superstitious in some of their practices.
Yeah, okay.
So in a world that was becoming more and more characterized by, this imperial unity
Mm-hmm.
and this sense of cosmic order, this idea of one supreme and personal God,
Right.
really resonated with that growing intellectual and spiritual yearning.
So they're looking for something more.
They were looking for something more coherent
Okay.
and meaningful
Yeah.
than those sort of, as I said, the arbitrary actions of those Roman gods.
Right. So Greek philosophy kind of opens this vacuum
Yeah, you could say that.
that it can't fill.
Exactly.
So something else has to come along.
Precisely. And then you have that significant presence of the Jewish diaspora
Mm-hmm.
with those synagogues that were scattered throughout the Roman world.
Yeah.
And the Jews, they'd already really established that concept of monotheism.
Right.
One God, this personal God that individuals can have a relationship with. And they were actively seeking converts among the Gentiles, which created this class, I guess you could say, of God-fearers
Okay.
who would attend the synagogue services, maybe adopt some of the Jewish practices,
Yeah.
but didn't fully convert to Judaism.
Right.
So these God-fearers were very receptive to that early Christian message.
So it built upon what they already believed.
Exactly. It built upon that monotheistic foundation and presented Jesus as that fulfillment of Jewish prophecy.
It makes you wonder, you talked about earlier that Jewish opposition.
Mm-hmm.
Could some of that be targeted at those God-fearers?
I think in part, yeah,
Yeah.
because there probably was a degree of tension,
Right.
even jealousy within some Jewish communities.
Yeah.
They saw these Gentile adherents
Right.
being drawn away by the early church.
Right.
Because ultimately, that Christian message offered a different path to salvation
Yeah.
and that broader inclusion of Gentiles,
Mm-hmm.
but without requiring a full adherence to the Mosaic law.
Right. That would have been a big point of departure.
Exactly.
So we've got this convergence, right?
Yeah.
Of factors that really seems to set the stage.
It's a unique moment in time,
It is.
for sure.
So how did this play out geographically in the 2nd century?
Well, so the spread in the 2nd century really followed those established routes of travel and commerce
Right?
that we've talked about.
Okay.
Those major Roman roads and those navigable rivers.
Yeah.
They really acted like the arteries for that spread of the gospel. So you see expansion eastward into Mesopotamia, and you have early centers developing in cities like Damascus and Edessa,
Mm-hmm.
southward into Arabia,
Yeah.
through places like Bostra and Petra, westward, across the Mediterranean to North Africa,
Okay.
where you have Alexandria and Carthage becoming these significant hubs,
Yeah.
and even northward into areas like Armenia, Pontus, and Bithynia.
Yeah.
And Antioch played a really crucial launching point for a lot of missionary activity
Gotcha.
in the East. Later in that 2nd century, you even see it reaching further west into Spain, Gaul, modern-day France,
Yeah.
and even Britain.
So you mentioned Egypt and North Africa
Mm-hmm.
becoming strongholds.
Yeah.
Did those have any kind of unique features?
Well, in Egypt, you see that the early church was predominantly Greek-speaking,
Yeah.
which again reflects the urban centers where Greek was dominant.
Right.
Now, tradition really strongly links Mark, the Apostle Mark,
Mm-hmm.
to the founding of the church in Alexandria.
Right.
But definitive historical proof is always a little bit hard to come by.
Sure.
But regardless of that, Christianity did flourish in Egypt.
Right.
North Africa was interesting because those churches were some of the first to predominantly use Latin
Okay.
in their worship and writings, which suggests an initial appeal maybe to some of the Latin-speaking population,
Yeah, okay.
and maybe even some with more social standing.
Gotcha.
But what was interesting was that the growth in both of those regions was mainly in the cities and the larger towns.
Okay.
Those rural villages, they tended to remain largely untouched by the Christian message.
So then Asia Minor, where Paul and others had been,
Yeah.
what does the church do there?
So Asia Minor saw really steady growth, and especially in those regions that had been evangelized by the apostles.
Right.
We have this great firsthand account
Oh, yeah.
from Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor,
Okay.
in Bithynia around 112 AD,
Okay.
and he writes a letter to Emperor Trajan.
Right.
And he was concerned about the sheer number of Christians.
He's like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Too many Christians.
He calls it a contagion
Oh, wow.
that had spread not just to the cities, but also into those villages and rural districts.
So he was freaked out.
He was not happy.
Yeah.
Encompassing people of all ages and social classes.
So it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's early on.
Yeah.
It was 112 AD.
It's spreading.
So that gives you a powerful snapshot of just how widespread Christianity had become.
Wow.
In a relatively short period.
What about Rome itself, the heart of the empire?
So the church in Rome likely began with those Jewish converts that were present in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost.
As described in Acts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it experienced steady growth, both in size and in prestige.
Yeah.
For at least the first century or so.
Okay.
The main language was Greek,
Oh, okay.
which suggests its early adherents came from, those more common,
Yeah.
perhaps less affluent segments of Roman society.
Okay.
But by the mid-3rd century,
Yeah.
around 251 AD, we have a letter from Bishop Cornelius of Rome.
Okay.
And it gives us a sense of the scale because he mentions a large number of clergy,
Yeah.
support staff who were dedicated to assisting the poor and the needy,
Right.
and a significant number of widows and some scholars.
Yeah.
Estimate that total membership might have been around 30,000 people
30,000 in Rome alone.
in Rome alone at that time.
That's wild.
It's a significant presence.
Yeah. But I thought there was some debate about that number.
Yeah, so some historians,
Yeah.
like the theologian Paul Minier, have proposed that maybe it wasn't actually a single congregation
Right.
of 30,000,
Okay.
but rather a network of smaller Christian communities.
Gotcha.
So each with its own gatherings,
Yeah.
which makes sense because Rome is a huge city.
Right. It's sprawling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So regardless of how they were structured, though,
Yeah.
it's clear that it's big
It's a big presence. Yeah.
by the mid-3rd century.
So how widespread is it by the end of the 2nd century?
Well, historian Kenneth Scott Latourette notes that Christians were basically active in all the Roman provinces,
Wow.
and even into Mesopotamia
That's really widespread.
and Tertullian.
Yeah.
Around 200 AD,
Okay.
he gives us these kind of vivid accounts
Okay.
of Christians being present
Yeah.
in just about every aspect of Roman life.
Oh, wow.
In the cities, in the towns,
Yeah.
in the military,
Wow.
even in the Senate.
That's wild.
So he paints this dramatic picture,
Right. It's everywhere.
yeah, of this widespread influence.
Okay, so let's move into the 3rd century.
Okay.
From 200 to 303.
Yeah.
What happens then?
So the 3rd century really sees a notable shift
Okay.
in the patterns of growth.
Yeah.
So from 200 to around 260 AD,
Yeah.
you see this steady expansion,
Okay.
but it's not really explosive.
Right.
But then starting around 260 and going up to the start of Diocletian's persecution
Right.
in 303,
Yeah.
the church experiences a phase of really rapid growth.
Okay. And I thought you said earlier that the early growth was mostly in urban centers.
Yeah.
So what about this later growth?
Well, that's what's interesting.
Yeah.
This was a primarily rural phenomenon.
Interesting. So why would it shift like that?
Well, you have to consider that this is a really turbulent time
Yeah.
for the Roman Empire.
Okay.
You've got significant civil strife. You've got the rapid succession of emperors, the Baric emperors.
Right. Yeah.
The empire was facing increasing pressure from those Germanic tribes along the borders.
Right.
There was a lot of internal instability
Yeah.
economically.
Yeah.
There was a lot of disruption. You've got inflation that was hitting the rural populations particularly hard.
Okay.
And so it was hard for them to maintain their livelihoods.
So they're struggling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you have that kind of widespread uncertainty and hardship,
Yeah.
people start to question their traditional beliefs and
Yeah.
practices.
Right, yeah.
And in contrast to that turmoil, Christianity offers this
Yeah.
simple and direct message of hope.
Okay.
It offers social justice
Yeah.
and the promise of divine power that can overcome
Right.
what a lot of people perceived as malevolent spiritual forces.
So they're looking for something to give them hope.
Right.
And a reason to believe again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this message, it resonated deeply with those rural people who felt perhaps neglected
Right.
or even disenfranchised
Yeah.
by the traditional Roman structures.
So they're like, maybe this is the way to go.
That's exactly.
It's something different. Yeah. Interesting. So is that why it grows so much in the countryside?
Well, that, and you also have a period of relative peace
Okay.
for the church itself during this time.
Yeah.
So for about 40 years leading up to Diocletian,
Yeah.
the Roman government was really preoccupied
Right.
with these political and military
Mm.
issues.
Yeah.
And so they left the church largely undisturbed.
So they could kind of grow and establish themselves.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so that allowed those Christian communities to grow and really consolidate
Yeah.
their presence in those rural areas.
But then Diocletian comes along
Right.
and changes everything.
Right.
So how bad was that for the church?
Well, so Diocletian's persecution, which lasted from 303 to 311 AD, was a really severe trial.
Right.
We have records of about 1,500 martyrs
Wow.
who died for their faith.
And who knows how many more suffered.
Yeah, countless others faced imprisonment,
Right.
torture, or even the agonizing choice
Yeah.
of renouncing their faith to save themselves and their families.
It's hard to imagine.
It is. Even the Bishop of Rome at that time reportedly wavered under pressure.
Wow.
However, despite the suffering and the loss,
Yeah.
the persecution didn't destroy Christianity.
Right.
I think, if anything, that resilience and courage
Mm.
that a lot of Christians showed
Yeah.
probably just strengthened the faith of those who remained.
And then Constantine comes along
Right.
and it all changes again.
It does.
So what happens next?
Well, the persecution finally ends
Yeah.
with a series of edicts.
Okay.
You have Constantine's Edict of Toleration in 311,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Edict of Milan in 313,
Right.
which granted legal status and religious freedom.
So that's a huge turning point.
It is.
And so by 325, when they have the Council of Nicaea,
Yeah.
where are we?
Well, by 325, the gospel had basically been preached in every city and province in the empire.
Wow.
However, the distribution of Christians varied a lot.
Okay.
So some areas like Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt,
Yeah.
and North Africa had experienced the most rapid growth.
Gotcha.
They had these major centers in places like Rome and Lyons and Gaul.
Yeah.
Other regions,
Yeah.
especially those more rural parts of the Western Empire,
Mm-hmm.
had a much more limited Christian presence at that point.
Okay.
Historian Adolf Harnack estimated that by Constantine's reign, there were maybe 3 to 4 million Christians within the empire.
It's a lot.
It is,
Yeah.
with some provinces possibly having as much as half the population Christian,
Wow.
and majorities in certain urban centers.
Yeah.
Now, this official recognition
Yeah.
and this favor under Constantine, that definitely led to even more increase in numbers. Although some historians suggest that the quality, the depth of faith
Right.
among some of these newer adherents might not have been as profound.
Right, because now there's no risk.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's clear that both those large-scale societal shifts
Yeah.
and the dedicated efforts of individuals
Yeah.
played this, crucial role
Yeah.
in that early church growth.
Yeah. So let's talk about the individuals.
Okay.
How important were missionaries?
I mean, they were absolutely fundamental
Right.
to the spread of Christianity.
Yeah.
It was, I think, an inherent characteristic
Yeah.
of the faith
Right.
right from its start.
Yeah, it's like built into the DNA of Christianity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They were following the example of Jesus himself
Right.
and that great commission he gave to his apostles.
Yeah.
So the early church, they understood themselves as a missionary movement.
So who are some of these early missionaries?
Well, so the early church historian, Eusebius,
Mm-hmm.
he recounts this tradition of the apostles themselves dividing up the world
Wow.
for evangelization.
That's a big task.
It is.
Yeah.
So they assigned regions like Parthia to Thomas,
Okay.
Scythia to Andrew,
Mm-hmm.
the Roman province of Asia,
Yeah.
centered around Ephesus, to John,
Okay.
And then you have Pontus, Galatia, Bithynia, Cappadocia, and ultimately Rome to Peter.
Wow.
In the 2nd century, we start to see these itinerant missionaries,
Okay.
individuals that would travel from place to place,
Yeah.
like the Apostle Paul,
Right.
specifically spreading that Christian message.
So they're going out on purpose.
They are, yeah.
Yeah.
And we even have the Didache,
Yeah.
which is a late 1st or early 2nd century Christian text.
Right.
And it gives us these guidelines for welcoming and discerning
Okay.
these traveling apostles and prophets.
Interesting.
So that shows how important they were.
Right.
And then later on, Origen,
Mm-hmm.
writing in the 3rd century, he talks about those dedicated Christians
Oh.
who would travel not just to the major cities,
Yeah.
but to those smaller towns, villages, even individual homes
Right.
in the rural areas.
To spread the word.
Exactly.
So we've got these dedicated individuals going out.
Mm-hmm.
What about the bishops?
Yeah, so the bishops played a really significant role as well,
Okay.
particularly in extending that reach
Okay.
beyond those initial urban centers.
So they kind of take it further out.
They do.
Okay.
So those bishops of the larger, more established urban churches,
Yeah.
they would often evangelize the surrounding rural areas
Okay.
and those smaller settlements within their diocese.
Gotcha.
And as new Christian communities started to form
Yeah.
in those areas,
Yeah.
those established churches would consecrate new bishops
Okay.
and then send them out to oversee and organize these new believers.
So they're being very intentional about this growth.
Are absolutely.
Yeah.
And these missionary bishops,
Yeah.
they would stay in these newly evangelized areas
Yeah.
to provide instruction and leadership
Mm-hmm.
until the congregations were stable enough
Right.
to elect their own leaders.
So are there any good examples of these guys in action?
Yeah, so we have Irenaeus of Lyons
Okay.
in Gaul,
Yeah.
and he served as a bishop,
Mm-hmm.
but he also actively preached in the Celtic language
Wow.
to those surrounding tribes.
Really?
So he was really dedicated to reaching those outside those Romanized areas.
Wow. Interesting.
And another amazing example is Gregory Thaumaturgos.
Thaumaturgos. What a name.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And he became the Bishop of Pontus in Asia Minor.
Okay.
And he is credited with extraordinary evangelistic success
Wow.
in his region.
Okay.
He's reported to have converted a large portion
Wow.
of the population
Really?
and even transformed those pagan festivals into Christian celebrations.
Wow.
His name, Thaumaturgos, means wonder worker.
That's a good name.
It is a good name.
Yeah.
It reflects the impact of his ministry.
So it's like, it wasn't just the dedicated missionaries and the bishops, right? The regular people in the church must have had something to do with this too?
Oh, absolutely. The ordinary lay Christians,
Yeah.
they were likely the most widespread and continuous means
Yeah.
by which that gospel message spread.
Okay. How so?
So imagine
Yeah.
just individuals naturally sharing their faith
Mm-hmm.
with their family members, their friends, their neighbors,
Yeah.
business associates,
Mm-hmm.
at home,
Yeah.
at the marketplace,
Right.
just as they went about their daily lives.